ピロシキこれご飯入ってる。カツと卵も。カツ丼だ!
Can I just tell you guys that Yuri in off-season is my spirit animal? Katsudon! Now to begin making these piroshkis, we're going to start with the dough itself. For this, grab yourself 75 milliliters worth of whole milk and nuke this in the microwave until it reaches around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Mine was a little too warm, so I let it hang out while I worked with my dry ingredients. For the dry ingredients, take 170 grams worth of all-purpose flour, place this into a very large bowl, decide that you can't really add anything to this, and just let your flour hang out in this very large bowl. Now that your milk is ready, grab 2 grams worth of dry yeast and 2 grams worth of sugar and add this to your warm milk. Remember, you don't want your milk too hot, otherwise you will kill that yeast. Now make sure you do fully combine your milk, sugar, and your yeast together in your bowl, and make sure that you do let this sit to the side for around 10 minutes. This does need to bloom before we decide to use this. Now once it has bloomed after those 10 minutes or so, add your milk, yeast, and sugar mixture straight to your flour and begin bringing this together with some of that egg. Now this recipe is really small, so I only end up using 1/2 an egg that I lightly whisk together. Now when I start mixing the dough, I don't immediately start forming it into a solid thing. I like to try to make sure that I do hydrate most of that flour before I start pressing everything together. After it feels hydrated, after around 5 to 6 minutes, you can start forming this into a nice shaggy mass worth of dough. Once it's that nice shaggy mass like the Scooby-Doo variety, go ahead and place this onto an unfloured surface on your cutting board. Begin bringing this together by hand slowly and very thoroughly, so that way you fully incorporate all of the flour into the dough. Now the last thing you're going to need to do is fold in just a small dab of butter. This is only around 5 grams worth and you don't really need much. Now make sure you fold the dough over that butter, almost laminating it in a way, just so that way it fully incorporates itself into the dough. You're going to continue mixing this by hand and kneading it by hand for around 10 minutes. The overall goal is to develop a good amount of gluten and make sure your cutting board doesn't escape you, and once you have formed enough gluten, you're actually going to see a nice shininess come about on the dough. This is going to tell you that the dough is more or less ready to go, and this does take some time. When you can see that shininess to it and it doesn't really stick to your hands anymore, this dough is pretty much ready. What I like to do from here is form this into a ball, making sure that it is a nice top boule so it does rise evenly. So once you have this into your top boule like you would when you're making buns of any kind, we are going to place this in a lightly greased bowl. In a large bowl, place a small dab of olive oil at the bottom and use your ball of dough just to kind of spread it all about. Now cover this and let this double in size before we do anything else with it. While your dough is hanging out, we're going to make some steamed white rice. I'm making around 4 cups of white rice for this because I do like leftovers, but after you get your rice measured out and washed, place this in your rice cooker and just let it go. Now the next thing I'm going to make is some teriyaki sauce, and for this I'm making some cheat dashi with just around 2 grams worth of dashi mix and some hot water. You want to make sure that you just fully incorporate this. The hot water really is to just dissolve everything. Now to this we are adding 30 milliliters worth of mirin and then 60 milliliters worth of soy sauce. Now I'm also adding 30 milliliters worth of sake, but feel free to leave this out if you don't want any alcohol. Give this a good stir and that's your teriyaki sauce. Make sure you give this a taste. If you want it sweeter or anything, you can add just a touch of sugar, but I like mine like this. Now the next really important component in any kind of katsudon is your onion, and I am using a nice sweet onion for this, but use whatever onion you want. You want to make sure that when you cut your onions for katsudon, you cut these to be slightly thick. The reason why you want them thicker is so when we go to steam them later in the teriyaki sauce, they don't actually disintegrate and turn into, well, onion soup and just turn into mush. Once you have all of your onions cut up, place them into your bowl of choice and let's get ready to cook this down with some of that teriyaki sauce. In a large saute pan, add a splash of oil of choice. Throw your onions right on top of it. You want to make sure that the oil isn't super hot because you don't actually want a ton of color on these onions. If your pan is too hot, you're going to end up giving these onions too much color before you start actually cooking them with the teriyaki sauce. After only around 2 minutes of cooking them with just the oil, place your teriyaki sauce right on top of them, throw a lid on it, and let this steam for at least 7 to 10 minutes depending on how thick your onions are. You want these to be super soft before we add in around 100 grams of peas. Yes, peas are optional. I believe that's what they had on the pork katsudon on Yuri on Ice, so I'm gonna go with the peas. But you're going to add those peas in right before you turn off the heat on these onions and just throw the lid on it and let it hang out until we're ready to actually use them. Now we can actually come back to our dough after it has doubled in size. This took around an hour to finish off and double in size, so your mileage will vary. Now give this a nice press, degassing it just a bit. Make sure to be nice to your dough. You don't really need to pound this out too hard. And once you have this pressed into a small disc, I'm going to measure mine into 65 to 70 gram portions. This is going to be totally up to you, but I like this size for how we're going to use it for the filling later. Once you have everything portioned out, the easiest way to roll these back into a ball when they're flat like this is by tucking the bottoms into itself, so you can kind of start forming a ball rather than trying to force it on a cutting board. This allows you to get a nice tight ball, so this way they can relax again. Because we're working the dough the second time, this does need a second proof like you would with any kind of a burger bun. Once you have all of your dough balls rolled out, grab yourself your pork, and my pork in particular doesn't need to be pounded out, so I'm just going to use it like this. I also had a bunch of eggs that I had dropped the carton of, so I have those ready to go. Just make sure you give them a quick whisk because this is going to be your egg bath and for your omelet later. I'm placing a small portion of my eggs into this pie dish so that way I get my breading station ready to go. Remember, don't use all of this, especially since I had leftover quiche batter that I'm just going to throw in there. It's going to be fine. Quiche is just eggs and cream, so this is going to be fine for the egg wash. Once you have this slightly mixed together, make sure you season your pork, season your eggs, your flour, your panko with salt and pepper because it does need a little bit of seasoning on there. Now, once you have those seasoned up, make sure you dredge your pork very heavily in flour. What I like to do is make sure I press them down very hard in the flour to make sure you get a nice coating of flour. Once you've coated it in flour, place this into your egg wash, then use the other hand to flip those in the egg wash, then place this into your panko next. Once you have it in your panko, use your dry hand to smash this thing straight into that panko, getting as much coverage as possible on that breadcrumb. You want to make sure you don't really have any exposed bits on your pork. That's super important. Otherwise, it's going to actually burn in your fryer, so just keep that in mind. Now, I'm shallow frying this, but feel free to deep fry it. And the reason why I'm shallow frying it is just personal choice at this point. You can deep fry these or shallow fry them or throw them in the oven, do what you want to do. While we're shallow frying them, make sure you have this over that medium heat around 325 degrees Fahrenheit. This doesn't take too long to start cooking, and once you have golden brown on one side, after that flip, get it golden brown on the other side, pull this directly out of your fryer and make sure you see how beautifully golden brown and crispy this, my God. Now pull both pieces of pork out of there and let them rest on a rack, almost losing them to the floor, and these can't be cut for a few minutes. Now strain out all of the oil you had used from your first pan and place this into a deeper pot. This second batch of oil is going to be used to deep fry the next piroshkis. Now remove your onions and your green peas from the pan and place them into a bowl, and can you do this a little bit? But there you go, use some chopsticks. Throw this into a bowl so they cool down before we load them up into our piroshkis later. Now in that same pan, hit this with a touch of non-stick spray without deglazing it or anything. Take your egg wash and place that into your pan. This is going to be our omelet. It's fine. You used a little bit of pork in there. Now you're going to turn this into an omelet. You know, it's a double use unless you want to save egg wash for a different dish later, but we're just going to do a flip-de-doo and make an omelet out of this. Once your omelet is slightly soft set, just turn off the heat and let the residual heat from that omelet finish cooking it. Of course, you have to inspect the omelet, making sure it was cooked properly, which it is. And now we have our omelet, our onions and peas, some white rice ready to cool down, and our pork ready to go. Now I want to look at the inside of the pork and make sure it is cooked, and this was cooked really nicely, a nice thin crust on it, still super juicy, and of course you're snacking. We're about to make piroshkis. I guess it's the first snack of the day, it's fine. Now unveil your beautifully proofed dough balls. We need to roll these out into around 8-inch in diameter. Your mileage will vary depending on how big you decided to make your piroshkis, but I went with that 8-inch in diameter. But what I'm also looking to do is make sure that they're not too thick, otherwise they won't cook properly. I rolled mine out to around 1/8 of an inch worth of thickness and that 8-inch in diameter. You're not really going to need any additional flour or anything, but make sure you do roll these all out at the same time so they relax around the same time. Now grab one of your piroshki shells and load this up with some rice. Remember, we don't want to overload these because we still want to be able to seal them. I used a small handful of rice like I would if I were making sushi. Now add in your rice right on top of your egg, and honestly, I probably should have just scrambled the egg. I think that would have been really nice as well. Now slice 3 thin slices worth of pork, placing that directly on top of your egg, followed by your beautifully made onions and peas. Now you want to make sure when you place your onions and peas on top, you don't really, dude, you're making a mess. You don't include too much of that liquid, otherwise you could saturate the dough. Now I went ahead and added just a touch of water to the sides of the dough to try to make sure that I could actually pinch this together and pinch it closed. I found that lifting it off of the cutting board and rolling this almost like a bao bun was a lot easier than trying to roll it on the cutting board. But I did overstuff this first one, and you can see as I struggle with this that it did have just a bit too much filling. I was able to make sure that I pinched all the dough together and slightly rolled this into a boule so that way everything was nice and tight on the bottom and I had a nice seal. I was really happy with how this first piroshki came out. Seriously, it looked really pretty. Now I went ahead and finished off all 4 of my piroshkis, making sure that I adjusted the filling as needed, and I found that kind of that bow rolling method ended up working the best for me, but I just know there's a babushka out there with a sandal in hand ready to smack me upside the head for doing it this way, so please forgive me. I also tried doing the fold over method to where you almost turn them into an empanada, but I found that I had more trouble doing it like this, even though it probably should be easier. My brain couldn't wrap the concept around my head, and I tore some of the dough, so this was as good as it was going to get in this way. Now, once you have all of your piroshkis ready to go, the last thing to do is really just cook them off. I wanted to make sure that my oil was around 325 degrees Fahrenheit, and since it was a little too hot, I went ahead and added some cold fresh oil to this to bring the temperature back down. Now I'm using the empanada one as a sacrifice to the oil just to see how this cooks in the oil. And it was cooking okay for the first 15 or so seconds, and then I realized it started to open up, so I immediately removed it from the oil so I wouldn't lose all of that oil, placed this onto a rack and just threw it in the toaster oven to bake. Now I prayed to the dough gods that the next one would actually work out, and to my very, very happy surprise, it ended up cooking very nicely. I did have to flip this halfway through, and it did slightly open on the bottom, but overall, I got some really nice color on these piroshkis. It had a nice golden brown color to it. It looked really light and airy, and I was really happy with that result. So the second one goes in, and it was able to hold its shape, but I noticed that this one actually hung out on the bottom of the pan just a little too long, and you can see there's a dark spot on that piroshki. So if you are using a deep fryer like this, make sure you pay attention to whether or not it actually sticks to the bottom. Now, after frying off all 3 of my piroshkis, I was still really happy with the result. They're crisp, they're golden, and now we get this beautiful cross section of a pork katsudon piroshki from Yuri on Ice. It just makes you happy looking at it, doesn't it? Look at the color. There it is, guys. The Yuri on Ice pork katsudon piroshki. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. It's literally katsudon inside of wrapped dough. Like, where can you go wrong? There's nothing. This is the perfect food right here. It's like, it's a meal in a bun. And look at the layers that this. Oh man, look at it. Look at the layers. Look at it. Beautiful. The one thing I wish I could have done was added more sauce. So I guess you could add sauce after the fact, but we're just gonna go in. Cheers. There's nothing wrong with that. The dough is super tender. The pork is still crispy. The rice is perfectly cooked. Like, the peas are great. The flavor from those onions really does pull everything together. And the egg is just super creamy. This is delicious. Unfortunately, this guy didn't work out too well, but I threw it in the oven, in the toaster oven for a bit, just to cook that dough through. And I mean, we can still eat it. I don't know about you guys, but this is super easy to make for the most part, and I will say it's kind of a nice little project you can do for the holidays, so if you need something to do whenever this video may come out. My name is Chef PK, get subscribed, remember, keep playing with your food. I'll see you guys later with some Yuri on Ice action. Do one of these. See that? Leg lift.